Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with reference recordings. Oh, and by the way, since I haven't said this in months, ClassicsToday.com, t-shirts and other merchandise available at the ClassicsToday.com shop. Have a look on the homepage of ClassicsToday.com, where it's rather obviously stuck up there so that you can go and source all of the fabulous merchandise that your heart desires. Anyway, here we're talking about reference recordings, recordings that represent the consensus of critics and listeners and cognoscenti the world over, at least in as much as I've been able to ascertain this in my 50 plus years peregrinating through that world and that universe. But so far from the reaction I've gotten from you all for these pieces, it seems like my prognostications and selections have been pretty accurate. Because, the fascinating thing about this world of classical music is that there's a lot more consensus than you would think, as I keep saying. There really is. There is less of it now, perhaps, than there was. But back in the day, some of you young'uns might not know this, there were many fewer recordings and many fewer record labels. And so there was a community of knowledge about what the recordings were, and everyone heard them and had opinions. And over time, these opinions coalesced into what we call reference recordings. So the work in question now is Rachmaninoff's Symphony No. 2. And as I pointed out in other talks on this topic, every piece has its own story. That's what makes it such a cool topic. That's why I love talking about this stuff, because we do get to talk about discographic history and whatnot. And the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony is a unique case. It's a unique type of case, let's put it that way, because there are others that are similar in that the work existed in a reference recording. Let's talk about what it was. Here it is. Philadelphia Orchestra, Eugene Ormandy, absolutely, on Sony or Columbia back in the day, stereo. That was the one. And the thing is, it's a glorious performance. It's fabulous. But the version that Ormandy plays has major cuts in the various movements, cuts which were sanctioned by Rachmaninoff himself. So it's not an illegitimate version by any stretch of the imagination. But over time, people began to question the necessity for playing the symphony with cuts. Back in those days, people just thought it was very long. Well, it is. It's nearly an hour long. I mean, with cuts, it's like 45 minutes long, 40 minutes. I know you can get through it rather quickly with the cuts. And so that makes it sort of like, well, people were like a little queasy about it, about keeping this the reference recording because it had those cuts, even though Rachmaninoff himself sanctioned them. And it's a perfectly legitimate way to look at the symphony. I prefer it without cuts because it's an incredibly beautiful symphony and it doesn't have anything wrong with it formally. Of course, some people go arguably too far in the other direction and play things like the first movement exposition repeat, which I actually kind of like too, actually, to tell you the truth, because it tells you where the exposition starts. Otherwise, the piece sounds like some, unending flow of dark romantic melody. But in any case, the fact of the matter is, whether you do cuts or no cuts or exposition repeats or whatever, the current trend, and it was the current trend 40 years ago, is to start playing the symphony complete without those cuts. And so as a result, this fell away as the reference recording. It was no longer considered referential enough. I think that was the problem. It's a shame, too, because it sort of fell by the wayside, but it was still a great recording. And Ormandy himself kind of jumped on the bandwagon in his RCA remake. And here it is, which is complete, absolutely complete. He played it complete, but rumor has it, and I don't know if it's true or not, that he was not happy doing it complete, that he preferred the cut version. Certainly, this is a very beautiful performance, but the earlier one, some might argue, is livelier and a little bit more exciting and had maybe more conviction. I don't know. It's really impossible to tell because you can't really compare the two versions. You're talking about like 15 minutes more music. So it's not a question of whether Ormandy's conviction was less. They're almost different pieces as a result. So this is a very good performance of the complete version. And it does have some interesting details, actually, that the first version doesn't have. But there it is. So he did it twice, once with cuts, one without cuts. But by the time he did the one without cuts, doing it without cuts was seen as a concession on Ormandy's part. And there was no way in hell the new version was going to become the reference. Because remember, a reference recording doesn't have to be the best recording. It just has to be the exemplar of the work that people use for purposes of comparison that everybody thinks is very good. So in the meantime, other people started doing uncut versions of the Second Symphony, and the reference recording became, largely due to the influence of the English musical press, which is not always bad. People say I hate the English and all this. This is not true. It's nonsense. I love English music. I love English artists. English critics I can do without. But, no two critics like each other. They're like, dogs. Critics, we're like dogs. You sniff each other's rectum and then you hate them. That's what critics are. But anyway, so the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony with André Previn and, of course, the London Symphony, because this was recorded, it was in 1973. When was the Ormandy done? Out of curiosity, because it will tell me. It was around the same time, 1973. Ooh. This was December 1973. This was in March and April 1973. Wow. Anyway, so there you go. So the point is this. Previn and the LSO were a very fine match. They really were wonderful together. I mean, they made fabulous recordings, and they were stars in the UK. They were on television. They did all kinds of stuff in the UK, and they could do no wrong. And this is not wrong. Previn was very, very good when it came to Russian music, and this is an excellent performance of the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. It really is. However, around the same time, or maybe a little earlier, there was also a recording on the same label, EMI at the time, with Yuri Timirkanov and the Royal Philharmonic, which is better. And everyone who heard it thought it was better. And everyone who knew it was better. But EMI did nothing whatsoever to promote it. You wonder why they even made the recording. It made no sense because this was what they were pushing like crazy. They were flogging it up and down. This was par for the course, by the way, in the English musical record world. For example, another example of similar such behavior, when Paavo Berglund remade his Sibelius cycle with the Helsinki Philharmonic, which you would think is an excellent cycle, and it is, done by a master Sibelian, because he'd already done a great Sibelius cycle at Bournemouth in the UK, so he should have been respected by the UK. But at the same time, the UK flavor boy of the month, Simon Rattle, was doing his Sibelius cycle in Birmingham. And so the Birmingham Sibelius cycle with Rattle, which sucked, was getting all kinds of attention and interviews and stuff and splashy front pages and gramophone and reviews all over the place. And the Berglund was completely, totally sidelined and ignored. And that's what they did, right? So this was a case of that. You have this very good Rachmaninoff Second Symphony, and it was immediately lauded as the reference recording for versions that were complete and uncut. In the meantime, everybody else was doing that. And there were versions out there. Like I said, Timirkanov was one, and there were others that were simply, I think, better. But it's not about better. It's about gets the most attention, the most acclaim, and the most promotion. And it's good. You can't, you've asked me, are there reference recordings that are really terrible? My short answer is no. First of all, there are very few recordings that are really terrible. But the idea that a really bad one would become a reference, no, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because just as there is a real consensus, there are actual standards. There is such a thing as an idiomatic interpretation. People know in these kinds of works, these repertory works that are part of the general repertoire that get played constantly, there's a range of legitimate interpretive options. People know what they are. They know when somebody is stepping outside of them in an unacceptable way, or in a witless, stupid, horrible way. orchestral playing is a fact. It's either good or it's not good. You can compare them, of course, but generally speaking, you won't hear people praising wretched orchestral playing as fabulous orchestral playing. People make excuses for it. As, for example, the Anthony Collins Sibelius cycle, which has horrible orchestral playing from the London Symphony, and people sort of say, well, it doesn't matter because of his interpretive insights. It always matters. That's the Furtwängler lie, that you could get away with sucky, horrible playing all the time because the vision was so amazing and immense. No, I mean, that's cultism. That's not music. Anyway, so there you are with Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. This is the reference. I mean, it was plugged by the gramophone people, the magazine, the critics, and the papers, everybody, because Previn and the LSO were a major thing back in the day. And I don't want to say that there was any sort of nefarious intent in declaring this a reference recording, because it's really good. It's a beautiful performance of the symphony. There are others, I think, that were better recorded, that were more exciting, subsequently, of course. But that's the reference. It is what it is. So Ormandy was displaced by this thing because his first version was cut. Now, there were certain American critics, American magazines, who stuck by their original Ormandy recommendation. And that was nice, actually, because it's not a performance that deserves to be dismissed. It really isn't. It's amazing in its way. Ormandy had a pedigree in this music that nobody else could boast. I mean, Philadelphia was Rachmaninoff's orchestra. He conducted them. They did premieres of his works. He sanctioned almost everything they did. They recorded the concertos with him and whatnot, back from the days of Stokowski. So you can't ignore Ormandy. But by the same token, it's a healthy thing when the baton passes, isn't it? I mean, some of you have asked the question, can there be new reference recordings? Well, here's an example where there was. There's a new reference recording. And it happened somewhat artificially because there are two versions of the symphony. It's not exactly the same thing that's getting played, but that's normal. It's normal. It's par for the course. Now, if I had to pick a reference recording, well, that will be the subject for another video. Future reference recordings. And there are quite a few, because there have been marvelous, marvelous performances of this symphony since. There really have. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me, and take care.